Well, now we're doing Unit 5B, and this has to do with an aspect of statistics, biases. And the information, please read over the boxed items on page 312 and 316. It's even better if you read the entire section. But boxes 312 and 316 summarize the information. And so for number one, a high school principal wanted to know how the teachers at her school felt about early dismissal. For homecoming, she put the names of the 114 faculty in a hat and randomly selected 30 of the names. She gave questionnaires to those 30 people asking whether they agreed or disagreed with the following statement. Valuable learning time should not be sacrificed for extracurricular activities. The questionnaires were filled out anonymously. Her conclusion was that 80% of the faculty were opposed to early dismissal for homecoming. Well, there's a problem with that study, and it was the wording of the question. The bias was demonstrated in the wording of the question. For number two, and so that's C, by the way. Number two, a health researcher randomly selected 500 high school students from the city of Oak Grove. In a private interview, the researcher asked the students whether they had ever used drugs. She concluded that only 8% of the high school students of Oak Grove ever used drugs. Well, there's a problem here, and it was the setting may discourage your honest responses, and so it's B is the correct selection. For number three, a researcher published this survey result. 74% of the people would be willing to spend 10% more for energy from a non-polluting source. The survey question was announced on a national radio show, and 1,200 listeners responded by calling in. Well, the type of bias is both participation bias and selection bias. How do you know what type of person's listening to that particular show, and then how many are really going to respond? So both selection and participation. So for number four, you're interested in the degree of satisfaction amongst customers at your video store. For 1 week, you hand a customer satisfaction questionnaire to every customer who comes into the store and ask them to fill it out and place it in a box after they check out. Well, it's the problem here is participation bias. A lot of times if you don't have an issue with whatever's going on, you're in a rush or whatnot, you're simply just not going to fill these things out. And choose the best wording for the question in the study. So number five, a recent magazine article determined that Gemini is the most popular car on the road. A TV journalist decided to check the accuracy of the article by conducting a survey. Which of the following survey questions will give the journalist the most accurate results? Well, let's say, what kind of car do you drive? There's no way to show bias with a very simple question like that. As for six, a researcher wishes to determine the level of support for a new environmental law. Which of the following questions will produce the most accurate results? And it's A, how do you feel about the new environmental law? Very straightforward and simple. So for 7 and 8, let's do 7, let's do 8. The problems are the same with both. So for 7, a host of a conservative talk show asked the listeners to respond to the following question. First, Do you think that environmental laws which restrict growth should be weakened? 20 people responded, and the next day the talk show host announced that the results of his survey suggested that 76% of Americans feel that the environmental laws should be weakened. By the way, there's a problem. Among the problems, first of all, there's selection bias. It's just a very particular type of person that's going to listen to that show. Participation bias, how many are going to respond. The wording of the question shows bias, and the sample is way too small. 20 people do not indicate the feelings of the entire country. So let's read 8. A researcher from an environmental group wishes to gauge political sentiment regarding a proposed environmental law. He obtains a list of 100 or 1,000 email addresses from an internet provider, uses a random number table to select a random sample of 100 of these addresses, emails the people in the sample asking them, how do you feel about the proposed environmental law which will improve the quality of our air? He requests that people respond to his question by email. After the study, he announces that 72% of Americans are in favor of the new environmental law. Well, we've got problems here. First of all, selection bias. There's people that don't have emails, or there's people that are not on this particular. Lots of people might not be on this particular internet provider dealing with it. So those that aren't are eliminated. Selection bias, participation bias. How many are going to take the time to respond unless they have an agenda, some issue with whatever's going on? The wording shows bias, and the sample still is way too small. 100 people is not a good enough indicator of how the country feels or the Americans feel about a particular issue. Number 9A, which of the following describes the process by which scientists examine each other's work? That's a peer review. Review by their peers. And finally, number 10, which of the following study results implies that there's a problem with the quality of education at Rydell High? And it says B, 25% of the senior class scored below average on the math portion of a national aptitude test. So it's B. Good.